GFSU. Today among us, we have one of the most renowned forensic specialists, Dr. Melahat Elif Gunce Eskikoy. She is a coordinator of International Committee of Red Cross, International Center for Humanitarian Forensics. She has completed her graduation from Marmara University, Faculty of Dentistry, Istanbul. She has obtained her PhD in Forensic Sciences from Istanbul University, Institute of Forensic Medicine. In Turkey, she was working as a forensic expert at the Council of Forensic Medicine. She moved to Canada in 2011 and led the Forensic Odontology section of Council Disaster Victim Identification Unit in numerous DVI operations. As a forensic expert, she has evaluated a broad range of cases such as forensic identification, intra and perioral trauma cases, bite mark cases, dental malpractice, and age assessment cases. She had also represented the council at various national as well as international platforms such as Children First program of UNICEF Turkey and the establishment of National DVI Unit, a project by Turkish police and German Bundeskriminalamt. She served as a liaison officer for the Judicial Modernization and Penal Reform Program and drafted several projects for the councils, including the projects for training on Istanbul Protocol. Before joining the International Committee of Red Cross in December 2017, she had worked at various institutions as an adjunct clinical professor. For example, she had worked at Western University School of Medicine and Dentistry, adjunct assistant professor at Western University Center for Transitional Justice and post-conflict reconstruction, and worked as an instructor at McMaster University Master of Sciences in Global Health Program in Ontario, Canada. As a ICRC forensic specialist in Manila, she delivered training in humanitarian forensic action and management of the death in emergencies and provided technical support to authorities involved in disaster response in various countries such as Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Pacific Island. In 2019, she was deployed to Abuja to oversee the forensic program of the ICRC in Nigeria, where she supported local authorities to develop a mass fatality response plan and the policy on forensic medicine and management of the dead. She had also facilitated the collaboration as well as cooperation between relevant governmental as well as non-governmental organizations to build a resilient forensic capacity and sustainable medico-legal infrastructure in Nigeria. She was appointed as a ICHF coordinator for the ICRC in March 2020. She authored several chapters on DVI in various forensic medicine as well as forensic sciences books, as well as she has published several articles. She has also co-authored manual for children protection centers in university hospitals in Turkey. She had also translated 3 books in philosophy as well as 3 books for children and youth from German to Turkish. So now I will take privilege to ask ma'am to start the session, and hopefully it would be a great session ahead. Welcome all.
Thank you, Dr. Ansari, for this very long introduction. I am very pleased to be here with you today to talk about mass fatality response planning. I will share my presentation with you, and afterwards we can have some questions and answers as the participants would like to ask some questions. As you said, they can write them down in the chat box. We can then get back to these questions after our presentation. So let me start now. So today we are going to talk about planning for mass fatality response. But let me first start with the introduction of ICRC. The International Committee of the Red Cross, established in 1863, is an impartial, neutral, and independent humanitarian organization to protect and assist victims of armed conflict. Since 2003, the ICRC is the reference organization in humanitarian forensic action, applying forensic science, principles, and methodology for humanitarian purposes. In 2018, the ICRC partnered with the Gujarat Forensic Sciences University to establish the International Center for Humanitarian Forensics. Its mission is to provide a platform for national and international collaboration to facilitate networking between various stakeholders through projects, research, academic programs, and to engage in policy development and implementation to further humanitarian forensics. To achieve these goals, GFSU and the ICRC agreed to co-govern the center, and I am the co-coordinator for the center together with Dr. Babu. So today we are going to talk about mass fatality response, the planning for mass fatality response. Emergency management consists of typically of 4 stages. It's the preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. Many countries have emergency management policies and plans in place. Most of them are the result of lessons learned from massive disasters. Although all of these plans recognize the fact that death may occur as a result of a disaster, they usually do not have a plan on how to respond to mass fatalities beyond having them as numbers. For instance, the tsunami in December 2004 triggered the largest international disaster victim identification operation under the umbrella of Interpol, led by the Australian DBI team. Indonesia was hit the hardest, but the international forensic identification efforts were focused mainly on Thailand's Phuket Island, because Indonesia did not have the means to provide reliable ante-mortem information on the victims. Today, Indonesia has a strong and engaged forensic odontology community committed to enhance the availability and accessibility of ante-mortem dental information in case of a disaster. Turkey, for instance, was hit with a massive earthquake in 1999. That led to the development of the Disaster and Emergency Management Presidency, AFAD. This is a well-functioning, well-funded agency and has plans to respond to emergencies at local, national, and international levels. A major earthquake is forecasted in Istanbul in the near future. Plans to respond to this earthquake estimate the death toll at 100,000. But there is no structured mass fatality response plan. The overall disaster management plan mentions the burial process, but how the dead will be recovered, identified, and reunited with their families has yet to be integrated into the process. The National Disaster Management Authority of India has published several guidelines for various aspects of disaster management. One of these guidelines is the management of the dead in the aftermath of disasters, which was issued in August 2010, with the contributions of the ICRC. This puts India ahead of many other countries when it comes to mass fatality response. So, why do we need mass fatality response? We need to respond to mass fatalities in an organized manner so that we can protect the dead through dignified and professional handling of human remains. This helps us to prevent people from becoming missing. If we can reunite the human remains with their loved ones, we can help families to cope with their grief and to have eventually closure. This also helps affected communities to heal after disasters. what happens, or why do we need planning? If we do not have structured plans in place, it will end up with chaos. Actually, all mass disaster response is pretty chaotic, even with the best preparation. But if you don't have any plans in place, the chaos is so big that you will not be able to function properly. But instead, if you would be able to put a structured mass fatality response plan in place, you will know beforehand what to do and how to do it. We have to use resources efficiently through effective leadership and coordination, and make mass fatality response plans an integral part of the overall emergency response plan. So we cannot have a mass fatality response plan standalone without the collaboration and coordination between the emergency response overall. What the priority is in any mass disaster is the rescue of the living and the wounded.
Just a minute, madam.
So,
Madam, have
sure.
you shared your screen?
I did.
Ma'am, we cannot see. That's what I wanted to tell you. Can you share the screen again, please?
Sure. I'm very sorry about that.
That's okay, ma'am.
Let's try it again. You should have warned me before. Can you see it now?
No.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can
Okay.
everyone see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Rehan, Ramya?
No,
Yes, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
But some can see, some cannot see it. I don't know what else to do. So
No, ma'am.
this is,
Did you go for prison now?
yes.
Okay. Can you see a screen besides your screen?
I can only see my presentation at the moment.
Rehan, Ramya, can you help, please? Everyone, please off your microphones, please.
Ma'am, can you go to your entire screen option under present now?
Yes, I did. I did.
Can you
That's
please
where I
try
am
that
at the
one more
moment.
time?
Sure.
Now we can see your screen, ma'am.
Yeah, ma'am. Now we can see your screen, ma'am.
Okay. You don't want to go back, right?
No, ma'am, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
Sorry.
we'll continue. Okay, no problem. So the priority in every mass disaster, in any emergency situation, is always the survivors. So whatever we do in mass fatality response, we must not impede the efforts to rescue and care for the survivors, the sick and the wounded and the living has priority. Another priority is the safety of the personnel and the community. In some cases,
Excuse me, madam. Sorry for interruption. Can you please share the screen again?
why is this not functioning? I don't know. Let's try it again.
Perfect, ma'am. It's working.
Yeah, it's working now.
Okay, so can you see it now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, okay, good. Let's continue. A lot of technical hiccups today. Let's go back to this screen. So the safety of personnel and community is a priority as well. The first thing that we have to take care is our own personnel. For instance, we have to make sure before we send our personnel to the field, we have to make sure that they are safe. If this is an armed conflict situation, we have to make sure that there are no unexploded devices. Or if this is a fire, we have to make sure that we are not putting our personnel in harm's way. We also have to take care of the community that we have covered, the community safety as well. Another priority is the preservation of the site, the human remains and personal effects. We'll get a little bit about this in a short while, but preservation of the site is key if we want to do a good forensic identification afterwards, because there is a lot to be found on the site, and as soon as we enter the site, we are already starting to destroy what we can find on the site. So the mass fatality response, and here you see the forensic identification part, management of that part of it. The mass fatality response is not a series of isolated events or activities. It is a process which starts before an incident occurs. Strategic planning, logistics, capacity building, and also important is the maintenance of grave sites and individual cemeteries. These are areas that we need to take care in, as I call it, peace times. When there is no emergency, we need to prepare. Preparation is key to a successful mass fatality response. So we need to have a strategic plan. We constantly have to build the capacity. We have to take care of logistics, and we have to know where to dispose of bodies. So the management of the dead starts with with establishing a reliable list of missing persons. It depends on the type of the disaster, how you want to go about this. But this is key to a successful mass fatality response. In the past, we had difficulties in the identification of mass fatality victims because we could not establish a reliable list of missing persons. So again, to avoid chaos, you need preparation beforehand. You need to know where to set up centers where people can report their loved ones as missing. One of the things that we have to be really aware of is when disaster happens, everybody wants to be supportive, everybody wants to be helpful, and everybody wants to be on site. But sometimes it is not advisable to have that many people. You only need as many people on site as you actually need to provide the services that you need to provide. These steps are ongoing. It's not, again, it's not in silos. It's not individual steps and activities. This is a process. So when you start with search and recovery, you can also start collecting antemortem information. As soon as the bodies arrive in the mortuary, you can start with postmortem data collection. Once you have enough antemortem data and postmortem information collected, you can start with reconciliation. And in the end, you have two options. Either you can release the bodies to the families, or you have to dispose of bodies. The disposal of bodies may need to happen if the families are not taking this on themselves. Sometimes families do not claim the bodies. So unidentified and unclaimed bodies need to be disposed of. And this is also the responsibility of the mass fatality response planning teams. It has to be, all this process has to be considerate of the dignity of the dead, because the dignity of a person doesn't stop when death occurs. It has to be respectful to the bereaved and affected communities, because death is closely related with religion and with culture. So if we can give families the opportunity to care for their dead in their own rituals, traditions, culture, religion, that helps them to cope with their grief, and it helps communities to heal. We have to be realistic about logistical and human resource constraints. If we can structure our mass fatality response plan good enough, then we can ensure the traceability and proper identification of the dead through close communication and coordinated cooperation between actors responsible for immediate emergency response and actors responsible for forensic identification. But one thing I want to emphasize here again is the importance of briefing and debriefing. Please keep in mind that no matter how urgent the situation is, you should always take the time to brief before you start the process. And at the end of the day or at the end of the operation, you also need to take the time to debrief. Briefing and debriefing have benefits beyond sharing information. You can help your own personnel to cope with the trauma by sharing their experiences throughout this mass fatality response in the debriefing. And this is an important step that should not be neglected. But really, it needs to be coordinated. There are multiple agencies involved, and if we cannot coordinate the efforts of these agencies, we are going to lose important and very valuable resources. The forensic identification is a three-tiered process. Very briefly, it consists of collection of antemortem information, so the information about the missing person, and any information obtained during a medical legal autopsy, so postmortem findings, and the comparison of these two data sets, which leads to reconciliation of the data and positive identification, if we can find enough information. So it is crucial that we understand it is important to have all these at the same time. Having no antemortem information, but having the best post-mortem or medical legal autopsy performed will not help us if we cannot find the information to compare with. So when you plan for a mass fatality response, you have also to consider which data is relevant for identification. Who should collect the data? How should this data be documented? Who should have access to the data? And how should the data be stored and for how long? There is a lot of personal information in this data that we collect. So who should have access to this data? And should this data be stored forever? For how long? What is the threshold for that? For instance, when you collect data from dentists, then the dentist should know that they are giving only permission to use this data for forensic identification and for nothing else. Same goes with DNA, with fingerprints. When you are collecting data for forensic identification should be the limits of the use of this information. For an effective coordination we have to acknowledge that this is a multi-agency, multidisciplinary effort, with each agency having an important function and responsibility. To ensure maximum efficiency, create and implement effective structures, plans, and liaison arrangements. Identify the agency which has the full authority and responsibility for the management of the dead in accordance with existing disaster management plans. Include available key operational partners. This is very important that we map who are the stakeholders of mass fatality response. Again, multiple agencies have shared responsibilities. It is a multidisciplinary effort. It depends on the type of the disaster, which one of these agencies and disciplines you are going to employ. But you have to have a plan in place where you know to which agency you should refer to. You have to establish a command and a command structure and proper channels of communication. So one of the most weak parts of mass fatality response plans, if there are any in place, is the communication between agencies. If this communication lacks, if we do not know what the other agency is supposed to do, we cannot really maximize the efficiency of the resources. And we have to form operational units assigned to specific duties and responsibilities, and this should also be foreseeable. Which unit is going to do what? Otherwise, we will have a lot of people doing the same work and nobody doing the work that is actually needed. And this is very risky, and we do not want to risk that. That's why we need a mass fatality response plan. The dignified and professional management of the dead requires close communication and coordinated cooperation between actors responsible for immediate emergency response and actors responsible for forensic identification. So who are the actors responsible for immediate emergency response? First of all, most countries have a national disaster management agency under several names with various responsibilities or scope of responsibilities. Law enforcement is one actor for immediate emergency response. We see, of course, police or the armed forces respond to a mass fatality or mass disaster in general rather very quickly, especially armed forces have, and the police have the discipline that is required to really function well in a mass disaster. And actors responsible for forensic identification should also not be isolated in the mortuary. There needs to be a flow of communication constantly between all these actors so that we can ensure that everybody knows what they are doing and why they are doing it. The coordination of a mass fatality should start at local level. It depends on the number of victims and on the existing capacity. If it cannot be handled by local capacity or local resources, a regional response can be activated. If it exceeds the regional capacity, a national plan can be deployed. Or the affected country may request international support. But this all require proper preparation, an activation and deactivation process, and humanitarian diplomacy. We all may feel compelled to give support, but sometimes less is more. So instead of trying to be on the site, we have to be really mindful about if I join the mass fatality response? How useful will my contribution be? So this is an important part. Another important part is the activation and deactivation process, to which I will speak in a moment. So the mass fatality response should have multiple elements. One key element is logistics, and I cannot emphasize this enough. Logistics is key because we do not only talk about logistics in terms of material, provision of material, but also when the team is deployed to the field, where and what can they use as a washroom facility? How are we going to accommodate them? Who is going to deliver the water that they are going to drink? Who is going to feed them? If it's an international deployment, do all the team members have a passport? Do they have their vaccinations? These are all areas that need to be planned ahead and ensured that everything is actually up to date. Forensic identification teams, we need to have a pool of forensic experts who can be deployed to a specific incident. Forensic sciences and forensic medicine is a very broad range of various disciplines. So we have to know whom to deploy and where and when. To be able to do that, we need to have an inventory or a roster of who can be, to whom we can refer to. We have to make sure that we understand the needs of the families, their religious and their cultural and traditional ways of coping with grief. And we also need to understand that families are a major source of information. So we need to have people in our team who can access families and consult them in terms of what the process is, but also receive information about their missing loved ones. Again, communication is key. We have to have open communication channels at all times. We have to make sure that the quality assurance is in place for all the processes that we are applying here. A command structure needs to be identified beforehand, and an activation, deactivation process. So why am I saying this? These are important, this is an important task, mass fatality response, or any emergency response for that matter. So we are actually deploying resources, we are deploying people, and that needs to have a starting point. When am I going to activate the local resources? When am I going to activate the regional response plan, etc.? And then a mass fatality response should also consider when to deactivate all these efforts, because it can take months, if not years, to actually complete the forensic identification of all victims of a mass disaster, if you are lucky enough to really reunite all the victims with their families. So we have to keep in mind that the deactivation is also a key part of mass fatality response. So when we look at the plan, we have to keep in mind, what is the purpose of the mass fatality plan? What is the scope of this plan? We have to be really clear about all these. Identifying key partners and stakeholders is important for us to establish a very solid infrastructure and capacity. We need to be aware of the risks and hazards that we are putting ourselves, our teams, into, and mitigate these risks and hazards. We have to take care of the health and safety of our own personnel and of the community. we need to have a very structured and solid information management system in place. And again, communication. But communication is, here communication is also communication with the public. Because any mass disaster has, of course, has the interest of the communities, of the public, often also international media as well. So if we look at communication, it has to be accurate, clear, in a timely manner, and it has to be updated as new information becomes available. Because if we do that, we can ensure that the stress of the community and the families is reduced, we can diffuse rumors, and we can clarify incorrect information. Because if we do not provide this information in a timely manner, then we risk that there is a void of information which is very fast filled with people coming up with theories, with their own theories, and this is something that dealing with these kind of rumors is much more difficult. And the communication, of course, has to come through specific channels. It is not appropriate that everyone talks to the media. No, there should be a certain communication team or a spokesperson who is giving the information to the public. When we look at a mass fatality response plan, we need to be aware of the human resources and equipment needs. We have to select them carefully and according to the scope and type of the disaster, according to the location and accessibility of this location, according to available infrastructure, number and nationality of victims, the working conditions, and the condition of the bodies. So if we have decomposed bodies, skeletonized bodies, it's best to have, of course, a forensic anthropologist in the team. If we know that the bodies are well preserved, if it's a fresh incident, forensic pathologists should be a stronger team of forensic pathologists, and of course forensic anthropologists can support this as well. Forensic odontologists, if are very useful in these incidents. So we have to really make sure, do we need a fire rescue team here or not? So to be able to deploy the right people to the right place, we have to be sure that we select the right team. But to be able to select these teams, we have these teams available. We have to have these personnel available in our roster. So we need to know who is available for this particular job. That is also part of the planning. Equipment. When it comes to equipment, we need to know what equipment is available. We have to map available local resources. We have to provide relevant and reliable equipment. We need to inspect the capacity of these equipment regularly and bridge potential gaps. Keep inventory and maintain adequate supplies. Identify and provide special equipment. And we need to invest in the training for competent use of special equipment. So it is of no use if we have the fanciest equipment, but we don't have the people to use them properly. Provide consumables, personal protective equipment. That is key. And that was, of course, a major problem during this pandemic. When it comes to human resources, we need to understand the skills of our existing personnel, their knowledge and experience, and match those with appropriate positions. We have to appoint the right people to the right task, rotate the teams in a structured and predictable manner if the response is going to take a longer time, and maintain and enhance their competency by providing regular and tailored trainings. One of the things that we need to also keep in mind is we need to look at the bigger picture here. We have multiple agencies, multiple actors acting at the same time for the same purpose, identifying the victims and reuniting them with the families. So for that purpose, we have to understand that all the actors need to be briefed about the overall operation. If a driver, for instance, does not know or understand why it is important for them to transfer the bodies without delay to the mortuary, the efficiency is going to be compromised. Same applies to the forensic experts. So the forensic experts need to understand what are the challenges in the field which may cause delay. So these are the important elements of a mass fatality response planning. Brief them together. Also, when building capacity, all these actors should be involved. Having joint trainings, simulations is also very important, because in my experience, when these agencies are often very competent in their own field, but what is lacking is this coming together in an emergency situation. So the agency itself knows what needs to be done, but they don't necessarily know how their contribution is actually helping other agencies. So this is one of the reasons why we need to have a joint training and simulation at least once a year. One technical aspect, it also goes under logistics, of course. We need to ensure that we have proper storage for bodies. If the local capacities are exceeded, we need to make sure that there are also plans for temporary burials, because unless the person is identified, we do not want them to be cremated if the person is not identified yet. So this is an overall view of mass fatality response. But this year, 2020, actually started with something that many of us were not expecting. It hit us with the coronavirus. So on March the 11th, WHO declared this as a pandemic, and I was in Gujarat at that time, and Gujarat at that time did not have any reported cases, but things escalated very soon. So after the pandemic was declared by WHO, I was giving a conference at the Gujarat Forensic Science University on March 16th, before I traveled back to Delhi. And in the middle of the conference, I was given a note that the students need to be released to go home. Things developed so fast, and all of us, every one of us knows, of course, how difficult the times have been. So I made it timely enough back to Canada before the borders closed. But of course, it was a very sad picture when at Istanbul airport, I've seen never seen something like this. All the flights canceled, only a few flights still operating. So the world was actually on lockdown, but this also was a logistical nightmare. So how are you going to provide or transport material when the airlines are not working, etc. So we will learn lessons from this pandemic for sure. And then, of course, the pandemic was really growing very rapidly, and decisions were made on our hourly basis. Almost all countries struggled to deal with this, and the death toll was rising, and the local capacities were exceeded very soon. And the growing number of deaths required, of course, temporary solutions like these refrigerated trucks to store the bodies until burial arrangements could be made. Of course, one of the difficulties of this pandemic was also that the families could not always engage in the burial of their family members, either simply because there was a lockdown and stay-at-home orders, but sometimes, of course, the entire family was affected, and there was no possibility to take care of the burial arrangements as they would normally do. So that was all part of the response itself. But one thing was also very striking. There was a lot of misinformation and disinformation around there, and this led to stigmatization. Especially social media became an incubator of disinformation, which confused the public, made them scared and angry. There's still a lot of back and forth about the use of masks, etc. But this also led to stigmatization. On one hand, the public was declaring the frontline workers as heroes. On the other hand, there was also a struggle, should they receive basic accommodation and essential services out of fear of contamination. And then we can all, of course, admit that we are all tired of COVID-19. But this shows us that a proper planning, especially for infectious diseases or mass fatalities from infectious diseases, is absolutely necessary. Many international organizations developed or updated their guidelines, adapting them to the new situation. The ICRC has issued the general guidance for the management of dead on March 23rd. WHO issued their own guidelines on March 24th. And very recently, the ICRC, in collaboration with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and WHO issued their the interagency guidance for the management of the dead in humanitarian settings. The ICRC also published a guide on cemetery management during COVID-19. Just like the tsunami in 2004 was a historic milestone in disaster victim identification and led to the revision of the Interpol DBI guide and also the establishment of DBI in respective countries. This pandemic is forcing us also to revisit our approach to mass fatalities. We will draw lessons from our failures and hopefully use this to improve our processes for a more efficient response. And with that, I would like to hear from you and have questions if you have, and I will try to answer them. I want to leave you with a very nice picture of the Niagara Falls of Canada, just to lighten up a little bit in these rather dark times. So thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, I would be very happy to answer them now. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an informative lecture. Thanks a lot. If anyone has any question, you can post it onto the chat box so we can discuss it with the ma'am.
Should I pick the questions from the chat box, or are you going to coordinate the questions? Dr.
Ma'am,
Ansari.
if you are willing to pick up the question from the chat box by yourself, it's fine.
Okay. Okay. It was I have seen a question.
Ma'am, I'll put forward to you. There is a question from Pratik Kadam.
Yeah.
Use of entomology can be used in the cases of mass fatality or not?
And entomology is a very specific field, and of course, it has a place in the forensic identification part. It is dealing with, of course, the insects, which can give us information on when this event has happened. So there is certainly use for forensic entomology, but again, I want to caution that it depends on the situation itself. So what is the incident? Do we need an entomologist for this specific incident? Or if we are dealing with decomposed bodies, then I would say it's more useful to engage the forensic entomologists to consult with them. So definitely use of entomology is important, but we have to know when to employ those.
Thank you, ma'am. Anyone else who likes to put in the questions? We are open for the questions, please. Do we have any questions in the chat back from YouTube?
There is one question about what's the time period for which an unidentified body should be preserved in mass fatality scenario. That's a very good question. Mass fatality response requires also a legal framework, and this should be included in the policies. If you cannot identify a body, what are you going to do with this body? You cannot, of course, have the body stored indefinitely. You need to have also a plan for this. Some countries say for unidentified, unclaimed bodies, they will keep them for 15 days. Some will keep them for 3 months. But in many countries, I have experienced that the time of storing such unidentified bodies for much, much longer. But of course, this causes a restraint in the body storage capacity of the respective countries. So we have to be mindful about that. But as I said, we do not advise cremation for unidentified bodies. Instead, we can have temporary burial places available. But then a key element for this is documentation. So today I did not talk about the process of forensic identification, but documentation is really key if we are going to temporarily bury an unidentified body, because we need to know what happened. So we as I said, traceability is important here. So we have to be able to follow what happened to this body, who was responsible for this body, where was this body being transported, and that needs to be very well documented. We need also to be able to get back to this to the temporary burial place and know exactly where we have buried that that body once new information becomes available and we can actually proceed with positive identification.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am, there is one more question.
Okay.
That should we conduct the autopsy for every victim which we collected from the disaster site? It's compulsion.
Again, this is also a policy issue. When we talk about, of course, very high numbers of victims, so we have to make the distinction between a full medical legal autopsy, which again, in different countries, different legislations, different policies exist. let me give you an example of how Turkey was doing this. In a mass fatality event, if the cause of the death is known, a full medical legal autopsy could be waived. However, it was not really waived. Turkey requires all 3 cavities to be opened in a medical legal autopsy. So all victims were subject to this this process, but there was no toxicology samples taken from these bodies, except for the people or the victims who were suspected to be responsible for the incident, like in an airplane crash. The cabin crew and the pilots would require that their toxicological samples were taken from them to investigate further. But again, in COVID-19 related cases, for instance, a medical legal autopsy is not required, and medical legal autopsies for other reasons should also be limited to avoid the spread of the virus as well, because it's a very invasive procedure, and this may spread the virus even further if it's necessary, for sure. But for COVID-19 related cases, mostly a medical legal autopsy is not required.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Ravati Rajan. In cases like Malaysia, presence of dental records is not consolidated, and some don't even have any records. In cases of mass disaster and advanced decomposed remains are recovered, is there any method of identification other than DNA?
So the primary identification methods are fingerprints, dental structures, and DNA. So now this is from a more theoretical perspective. When you go to the field and you are dealing with a mass fatality incident, the bodies that you will recover will not present themselves as in full scope of all these 3 primary identification methods. So for instance, you may not be able to use fingerprints. You may not be able to use dental structures for not only for the lack of antemortem information, but also for the lack of the skull, for instance. So you have to be able to make the decisions based on the incident itself. So what is required from you at that point? The dental structures are really a very effective and useful method. DNA is time-consuming, requires specific equipment, and it's also not a cheap method. So you want to be able to utilize another methodology, but also you want to use more than one primary identification method for positive identification. So if you can narrow it down through dental structures, for instance, and use DNA for confirmation, that saves you a lot of time and resources. And yes, I do know that antemortem dental records are not always available. But one of the mass fatality response planning, a key element is also, as I said, we need to understand why this information is important and how are we going to get this information. So working with dental associations and encouraging them to keep records is important. But in this age, we also have a lot of other methods where we can use still dental structures, especially very personal markers in the front teeth of a person when they have a smiling photo. Most of us are taking selfies in our phones. There are lots of selfies, so these also can be used to identify. So you have to be creative, you have to be innovative, you have to use whatever you can find and use, but keep in mind primary identification methods, fingerprints, dental structures, DNA. This can be also supported by secondary identification methods like body decoration, tattoos, personal identification documents, etc. But these are, of course, also the topic of another webinar, maybe, how we are doing forensic identification. But from a planning perspective, if you look from a planning perspective, these need to be put in place. So where are we getting the fingerprints if we need the fingerprints? Again, who is going to have access to these fingerprints and to what purpose and for how long? We are talking about DNA databases, very important, but then we need the legislation for that, because this DNA has a lot of personal information that we do not want to be shared with other persons. So this is this all requires a proper legislation around it.
Okay.
I hope this answers your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, another question is, how about storing a molar tooth instead of whole body in cases of mass fatality?
Storing, you said?
Yes, ma'am. Storing a molar tooth instead of whole body in cases of
Um,
mass fatality.
The storage of an unidentified body is not only for identification, but this is now, I want to formulate it properly. So when we temporarily store or bury a body, we show respect for the dignity of this person, because our ultimate goal is to be able to reunite this body with their families. First of all, in some cases, you may not find a tooth to extract for DNA purposes. You can store a tooth to be able to have a DNA extraction later on. But then again, this requires a lot of effort and a lot of resources. And this needs to be done by properly trained people. And I want to combine this with another question, if you allow me, that I'm seeing on my screen. What would be your recommendations for general dentists to aid mass disasters? So that I want to now combine with the extracting a tooth, a molar, for identification purposes. So general dentists and forensic dentists have different objectives when they are doing their job. A general dentist is focused on providing a treatment plan for the patient. A forensic dentist is looking for evidence. So these are two different approaches. General dentists, it's not an easy task, I have to say, because when you are dealing with a dead body, it's not responsive like your patients would be. There are many difficulties in, of course, accessing the oral cavity. And if they want to help, we have to be really very cautious. Again, my personal experience in a plane crash in Turkey, a university wanted to help and they went into the temporary storage area for the bodies, and they examined the oral cavity, and they started to extract teeth for DNA purposes. But because they didn't have the proper training and knowledge, and they did not consult with anyone, they were extracting teeth that would not be of good use for DNA analysis. So good intentions are not always the best thing or sufficient when you want to have a professional handling of the dead. What I would recommend is to establish a roster of general dentists, maybe, to whom we have to really give training in what to do and what not to do, which is equally important in a mass disaster response.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, last two questions, if you allow me to, if you're not getting late. Yeah. How does a chaired body identification take place during a mass fatality?
Can you repeat this for me, please?
How does a chaired body identification take place during a mass fatality?
So how the forensic identification process works, is that what you are saying?
No, ma'am. Chaired body. If the body is chaired, how does the identification take place in cases of mass fatality?
What do you mean with chaired?
Purva, are you there in the meeting? Please, can you put forward the question, please? Okay, ma'am,
They are
we'll
asking
move
for
to...
a charred body.
Ah, charred. So a burned body, you mean? Is that what you mean?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Heavily burned body. Okay. Okay, now I get the question. Sorry about that. When a victim is exposed to a very high temperatures, the teeth can still be preserved and can be used for identification purposes. Not necessarily for DNA, which they are very useful also for DNA in burned victims, but also for a preliminary identity, establishing a preliminary identity through the dental structures. So teeth have proven themselves as very useful, even in victims exposed to high temperatures. So then the process would continue with all the steps that needs to be taken, but we have to be careful with burned victims because they are very fragile, and we have to be able to preserve them until we transfer them to the mortuary and beyond. It's we can still have a lot of information from a burned body, depending on, of course, the degree of the burn, but we can still obtain a lot of information from the body if we are diligently doing our work. It requires a lot of attention and a lot of expertise, and we have to look from a very so we have to really take our entire expertise and our creativity as well to make sure that we get to the bottom of collecting information from the body. But definitely it should be subject to the same process. Would that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay.
The last question is from Shruti. What kind of forensic team is needed in reason of mass fatality in cases of radioactive material or some poisonous gases explosion? Do you want me to repeat?
So radioactive.
Yeah, in cases of mass fatality, in cases of radioactive material or
Okay.
poisonous gases are used, what kind of
Okay.
forensic team would be needed?
First of all, I want to emphasize one more time that the safety of the personnel is really key here. So first of all, in such cases, or in any case, I would recommend that before we deploy the forensic experts, we would deploy the experts who can evaluate the situation in the field, whether it is safe for the forensic team to work on the victims or not. So that is one thing. Then depending on, of course, what kind of incident it has been, was it accompanied by an explosion or not, etc. All these needs to be investigated, and to be able to put together the perfect forensic team, we need to know the more information about the incident. So in my view, it is important to deploy a core unit first before we put together the teams, to actually evaluate the conditions, the needs in the field, and then select from the experts that are available who would be the best fit for this role. But depending on what kind of biological or radioactive hazardous material we are dealing with, that all requires, of course, a different approach and different ways of protective measures that we need to put in place. Again, safety first. Before we can ensure the safety of the personnel, we should not really jump into the operational work just to be fast and then rush into our work. Sometimes it's difficult because we all want to be active in the field, but it's better to wait until we get the green light from the expert teams that we can actually start working.
Thank you, ma'am.
This is
We have another question from Abraham Johnson. Abraham, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, that was not a question. Yeah, it was just a comment. Like professionals who are really trained in CBRNE activities are normally involved for these events than forensic professionals. Yeah, it was just a comment from my side.
Okay. Any other
you,
questions
Dr.
from the
Johnson.
house? Any other questions from the house? We have Nia Ansari to take over. Neha. Ma'am, we'll end the session here, please. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a session. And hopefully everyone is been satisfied with the question and answer sessions. You can post your further questions directly to us. We will forward it to ma'am if anyone wants any further information regarding anything. And hopefully have a great day ahead, ma'am. Thanks. Thank you again.
Thank you,
you
ma'am.
very much.
Thank you
Thank
from
you.
the
It was a
team of
pleasure.
GFSU. Thank you for sparing your time with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Thank you.
You too.